Well, as promoted off the top before we went to the ad break, we're joined now by the head of the Business Council of Australia, Jennifer Westacott. Thanks for your company.
Thanks, Peter.
I want to talk to you about this submission that you've got, as well as your opinion piece today around, in large part, company tax cuts. You're saying in the piece today that we can't afford not to deliver these company tax cuts. Why do you say that?
Well, ultimately, this debate is about our living standards. It's about what drives our living standards, which is really private enterprise that employ 10 million people, that are responsible for 80% of all of our economic activity, that pay, through both personal income tax and company tax, the majority of tax revenues that governments use for services. And it's about saying, well, if we want to maintain our living standards, we need to make sure our businesses are competitive, because we're living in a very different world, a very competitive world, and that they're investing. I mean, fundamentally, this debate about business taxes is about investment, not taxes. And when companies invest and they're given incentives to invest, they put on new equipment, they use better technology, people are more productive, people can get paid more, they can put on more workers, they can expand their operations, they can make decisions to stay in this country rather than doing business somewhere else. That fundamentally is what drives living standards in Australia, as well as, if we've got stronger businesses, we'll have higher revenues for health and education. So I think, we've got to get this debate back on taxation and business tax as to what it really means, living standards, better living standards for Australians.
What's your response to somebody watching who might say, if you deliver this cut, that might be good for the businesses themselves, but they're already here, they're already investing, they have to because there's a market, all that happens is that they pay us a little bit less tax. What's the answer to that?
Well, they don't have to stay here, and they don't have to stay here. I mean, all of these things are about what companies do at the margin. Do I, if I'm a high-tech advanced manufacturing company, do I do this in Australia or do I do it somewhere else? And other countries, Singapore, the UK, they are fiercely looking for those extra bits that companies are going to do and saying, well, why don't you do this in our country?
And would I be right in saying that that's actually more feasible these days than in the past, because that sort of cross-border commerce is easier now with technology than it's ever been before?
Absolutely, because everything's kind of like borderless, if you will. But also, if you think about the way, say, something like manufacturing's done, it's not done sort of end-to-end in one country anymore. Like you look at Boeing, the 787 tail rudder is produced in Fisherman's Bend in Victoria. And then if you go to that fantastic factory, you'll see made in Australia across the floor. Then you'll see parts that are made in China, parts that are made in the US, parts that are made all over the world. That's the new world of production. Now, many countries know that they want businesses to go and invest in their country, and they're using tax rates as a way of attracting that investment. So Britain, they've gone from 28 to 17, and just after the Brexit vote said we're going to go to 15. So we have to kind of get real about this. We're living in a very different world, and companies have choices about where they go and where they stay. And
the difference in those tax rates is even higher in our region than it is when you compare in OECD. But what about the reality, though, of where we're at? It looks like the government, yes, they'll put the legislation up, but it'll get voted down. The next step is going to be that they're looking to break up that legislation, so the reports suggest, and that they may look to try to convince Labor to at least support a different version, which is the cut to 25 cents for businesses up to $10 million in turnover. I mean, is that a second-best option that you'll support, or is that going to lose something?
Well, we've said the bill should go through in its entirety, and the government quite rightly has put it through has put it to Parliament, and there's an inquiry on that. The Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, that represents small business, says agrees with us. The bill should stay as it is. A couple of points here. It's already a compromise, this bill. I mean, it's already 10 years before large companies get the tax break that would bring them in line with their competitors. Now, we've supported that because we've said that's a careful, staged introduction. So we're already compromising. The second point I think people miss, Peter, is that the business community is highly dependent on each other. So, if big business starts to falter, small business will fail, because so many companies are dependent on a big customer to drive their orders, to actually drive their supply chain, and drive their productivity and drive their innovation. And then we've got to think about some of the companies that would miss out if you cut it out at 10 million. Blackmores, fantastic Australian story. World-leading company, into Asia, into China.
Labor doesn't even think that a turnover of 10 million constitutes a small business at the moment under their definition.
Which is, it just defies reality, some of this. I mean, Blackmores is a mid-sized company, but do we seriously want to say to Blackmores, this great success story for this country, we want to hold you back? You're in these markets where people have got 18% tax rates. We're going to burden you with a 30% rate. Bega Cheese, this fantastic story of kind of high value-added food production where we could be tapping into these big Chinese and Asian markets. Well, we're going to put a sea anchor on your capacity to do business across the world. That's the reality when people say, you know, for political reasons, look, we'll just cut it off at 2 million. And of course, let's not forget Bill Shorten's quote, and I think I've said this to you before, you know, when he was talking about this in 2011.
He was an advocate.
He was not just an advocate for company taxes. He said, meanwhile, lowering the corporate rate for smaller business only creates an artificial incentive for Australian businesses to downsize. So he's opposed to this. You know.
There's another criticism, though. The other criticism is that the benefit of the tax cut goes offshore. It goes to shareholders that live abroad or investors from abroad. What's the response to that? Well,
of course, some of the benefit goes to multinationals, and we want it to. I mean, you know, the reality is we are a small country with a small economy in a relative sense to the US and China and some of these big players. We're an open economy, and we can't do all the investment that we need from Australia. Australian companies, so we need multinational companies to come here. We need them to be investing here. We're seriously saying we don't want some of these companies coming to Australia because when they come to Australia, when they put money in, they employ people, they pay people, and they give a contract to a supplier. And then Australian companies will start changing their calculations of things they're going to invest in. They'll start saying, oh, something that wasn't viable a few years ago, that's viable. And of course, small business gets extra cash and they'll put extra people on or they'll expand their operations. And that's why the plan is a very carefully thought through, modest, carefully staged plan that sends the right signal for all of the business community to start investing.
Oh, you put the case for the company tax cuts in their entirety. But the biggest force that you're going to have to influence here is likely to be the crossbenchers.
Sure.
I mean, the Labor Party are essentially done on this. They're at best going to get on board with the $10 million carve-up of it post the initial legislation being put forward as per what the government took to the election. So if you're going to get that through, or if they're going to get that through, they're going to do it with the crossbenchers. What's your message to them? It's a pretty disparate lot.
Sure. Well, let's take a couple of the kind of core ones. So Pauline Hanson, and I totally respect her passion about regional Australia. But let's look at mining. In Queensland, you know, we've had big drop-off in mining activity, well, mining kind of profitability because of commodity prices. Yep. But what's the reality of that? 20,000 people have lost their jobs. So obviously that's influenced by commodity prices, but having high tax rates makes that very hard. So we want the next wave of mining investment to come back into this country, and that will be in some parts multinational companies. So that has real implications for people on the ground. Nick Xenophon, who I'm very sympathetic to for his kind of passion about manufacturing. Think about the modern world of manufacturing. It's going to be advanced manufacturing. It's going to be technologically driven. We're not going to win in manufacturing on labour costs, we know that. But we can win on advanced manufacturing, on technology, on getting into some of these specialised markets. That requires capital. That requires investment. That requires investment from big companies, mid-sized companies, working with small companies. That's not going to be driven by a few small businesses and a couple of cottage industries. This is a huge opportunity for Australia. We can actually be very successful in manufacturing. It can still be one of the flagships of our economy, but it's going to require capital and it's going to require investment, and that means our tax rate has to be competitive. Which
makes us more competitive, absolutely. We're out of time, though. Jennifer Westacott from the BCA, appreciate your time as always.
You're welcome. Thanks
Cheers.
very much.